there is an aspect of our lives that is really very important. It's something that we're dealing with, whether we think about it or not. It often can have a very negative impact, certainly a positive one as well, but it is a struggle that a lot of people have. And it impacts pretty much every area of our lives. Let's talk about it. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me. So first, I'm kind of curious, what possibilities went through your mind? I really would actually love to hear from you. What came up for you? What did you immediately anticipate that this video might be about? If you've followed me for a while, there's a good chance you might have a couple of ideas about it. So today we're going to talk about ultimately the number one obstacle when it comes to setting boundaries, or really boundaries in general. So if you can relate to this, I'm glad that you're here. And even if you think it's not too much of a problem for you, you might still benefit from this because it might be showing up in ways that can be problematic that you might not necessarily recognize. So I mentioned the idea of boundaries kind of being a part of every aspect of our lives. And the reason that I believe that that is true is because whether we are talking about like a family relationship or a co-working relationship, a boss-employee type of relationship, every relationship we have, there are boundaries associated with that. With many areas in our lives outside of specific relationships, boundaries are a part of that. How we spend our time, how we think about how we should spend our time, ways that we think about our to-do list, that time and effort and energy that we allocate to different kinds of things, the kinds of things that we allow ourselves to pursue and not. It really does overlap into really all of the areas in our lives. We might struggle more specifically with a certain type of boundary, like a relational type of boundary, than we might in like a time boundary, for example. But we still need boundaries in all of these areas regardless. And for the majority of people who are going to be watching this video, you've likely experienced some emotional and or sexual trauma in your life, childhood trauma in your life. And when you've experienced those things, that directly impacts your sense of worthiness, that affects your ability to identify and implement and enforce boundaries. I've talked about all of that before. And I've talked about a lot of the various struggles that come up in trying to do those things. The thing that is always, I feel like I can pretty confidently say always. If there's an exception I'm missing, please let me know. But I think anytime that we struggle with setting boundaries, no matter what type of boundary that is, the biggest obstacle to setting that boundary, sometimes even being able to recognize the boundary that we want or need, is fear. And I have certainly talked about fear in a lot of different videos in a variety of ways. But no matter what the actual struggle in setting that boundary might look like, the thing that is underlying it is, I really believe, fear. And it could be fear of what it could mean for that relationship or that situation. It could be fear of failing. It could be fear of feeling something that you don't want to feel, something that maybe you work really hard, maybe unconsciously, but still work really hard at protecting yourself from feeling, like guilt, for example. So even if you recognize, well, I feel really guilty and that's the biggest obstacle, not that that isn't true, but it's the fear of feeling guilty, right? It's the fear of not being able to manage the guilt that comes up, the guilt that is kind of reinforced by the comments of somebody else. It's that anticipatory feeling, that fear of being so consumed with guilt. And certainly in a work type of setting, the fear could be that there could be repercussions to setting that boundary that could affect your livelihood. So it's not that the fear that we have is necessarily always unreasonable or unrealistic, but it is still fear. And much of the time when I'm talking with people about boundaries, it's often in a more personal type of relationship, but not always. Oftentimes, many times over the years, there have been conversations about friendships that's still relational, but not necessarily family or partner. But work can be a really big aspect of that as well, because many people work, and it plays a really important and significant role in our lives in terms of the impact that it could have if we didn't have it, and the fear that we have around it not being present, and even the impact that it could have when we're going to work every day. So when we think about fear being the biggest obstacle to being able to acknowledge and certainly implement and enforce boundaries, it can help us take a step back and address the specific fears so that we can set those boundaries. Because when we're just thinking about it and we feel something, whether it's guilt, whether it is worry about the bad thing that's going to happen, which is fear, but when we're caught up in that in the moment, it really can override our ability to think about it more objectively. But that feeling is so real, and it feels as though we're feeling it because we're thinking about implementing it or because we're thinking about enforcing it. So it feels that that is the wrong thing. That doing that thing, that very specific thing, that has to be wrong because see how it's making me feel. When we can take a step back and think about, okay, what I'm feeling right now is actually just the fear of that happening. Not necessarily I'm feeling the repercussions of it happening. I'm not sure if that makes sense or not. So for example, let's say you need to set a work boundary, and maybe it's about your time and being able to leave work on time. If you're somebody who struggles with that, for whatever reason that you struggle with that, when you feel the feeling, right, you think about saying, no, I need to get out of here on time, or you're just going to leave on time or whatever it is, and you start feeling that unease. And that can look and feel a lot of different ways. You might name it something different. But when that feeling starts to come up, it's as if we're feeling it because that will be the outcome of setting that boundary. It's as if we're already feeling the reality of doing that thing. When we can recognize that what we're actually feeling is the fear of doing that thing, it really does help create space in between. So it's kind of like when we worry about something generally, and we feel that in our body, whether we're feeling sad, whether we're feeling angry, disappointed or hurt, or whatever it is. When we're anticipating something and we feel that, we're feeling it based on what we anticipate being able or experiencing. If it's a bad thing, we are already feeling the repercussions of that thing that we think is going to make it happen. I hope that makes sense. But the reality is we're only feeling the fear of that thing happening. So going back to the idea of a work-related boundary, when that feeling comes up, we're anticipating that if I set this boundary, the bad thing is going to happen. So let's say you're fearful that you'll get fired if you set that boundary, or that your boss will be angry at you. The fear comes up, and the fear that you're feeling is, or the feeling that you're experiencing is, as if your boss is mad at you, or you're living with the repercussions of getting fired. So it's very real, as if that outcome has actually happened. Again, when we can take a step back and recognize what I'm feeling is just the fear of it happening, then you recognize that that outcome has not happened, which gives you a little bit of space. Part of that space can be used for some reality testing. Well, how likely is it that I'd actually lose my job for leaving when I'm supposed to be done? Or how likely is it that my boss is going to be mad? And even if he or she is, what is the outcome of that going to be? So it gives us space in between the fear and the behavior versus immediately feeling as if that outcome that we fear happening has actually happened. I'm going to try to give another example, because I know that this can be a little difficult to really kind of wrap your head around and understand, because when we're feeling fear, or really any actual intense emotion, it is very real. We are actually feeling that feeling. It is a very real feeling. Unfortunately, for so many of us, because of how our mind works, how our mind tries to protect us, what we're feeling the repercussions of something that hasn't even happened yet. But because we fear it happening, we're experiencing it as if it has happened. So like if you worry about I don't know, if you like are running late and you're worried about being late for work, and you're just kind of playing over and over again that you're going to be late and what's going to happen, you start thinking about all the repercussions of being late. So what you're feeling is actually what the outcome would be if you were late, and all those things that you fear happened. So let's say your fear is ultimately that you lose your job. What you end up feeling in that moment before you're even late, what you end up feeling is the crisis of losing your job, the worry about what it means. You're actually kind of living that outcome before you're even late to work. When we can take a step back, it gives us the opportunity to recognize, okay, hold on a second. What is the reality of me being late? I think I'm going to be late all the time and I'm really not. Or I'm not usually late, and if I am late one time, it's really not going to be that big of a deal. Or if I am late, it's probably going to be a minute or two. Or if you are going to be pretty late, okay, I'll just call my boss and let them know that I'm going to be late. So it gives you space to work through and understand the actual likely reality in terms of outcome. Therefore, you don't get caught up in the intensity of the feeling of that outcome. When you practice that enough over time, instead of immediately having that fear, so this is true whether you're late or trying to set a boundary, when we practice that enough, we retrain how our nervous system responds. So when we're thinking about setting a boundary, we might still feel a little uneasy. We might be able to recognize that I'm afraid this is going to happen, but we can work through that so we can feel grounded as we set that boundary, instead of feeling the fear and pulling back and not setting the boundary. We can recognize what's happening, acknowledge that we're afraid of whatever that outcome might be, breathe into it and do some reality testing. What is the likelihood of that? And for a lot of people, part of what they fear is being a bad person. And there's a variety of reasons why people believe that, but they don't want to be a bad person. They don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. They don't want to be like other bad people. They don't want their own belief of who they are to be reinforced by this evidence of being a bad person. So when you can recognize, does setting this boundary make me a bad person? Or is setting this boundary a really actually healthy thing to do? When you have the capacity and the space to sit with that, you don't respond physiologically to the same degree. And from that place, it's easier to consider the boundary. It's easier to implement the boundary. It's easier to enforce the boundary when you have that little bit of space. So this is true really in all the ways that fears dictate our lives. And I've done a video on that before. But when it comes to setting boundaries, again, regardless of what type of boundary that is, recognizing what we're actually afraid of is, I think, probably the biggest key to being able to get to a place ultimately where you can recognize what the boundary is that you need or want, how to go about implementing it, and then how to enforce it when necessary. So understanding that fear, and you might be able to become aware of that in the moment that you're thinking about it. Sometimes it can be helpful to do it away from that kind of intensity of feeling and fear. So maybe just journal, give yourself a little bit of space to journal and think about the boundaries. Or if you've thought about setting a boundary in a particular area of your life, give yourself a little bit of space when you're not going to be faced with that situation to kind of work through some of that. It is really important also to recognize that, like everything related to healing, you can't just make a decision about it and then you're going to be able to do it and feel good about it. It really is something that you have to practice over time. It doesn't mean that you can't let somebody know what a boundary is relatively quickly, but to get to a place where you feel really grounded in what you want and how to go about having it happen, it takes a lot of practice because you're retraining how your body, how your nervous system responds. You're really kind of testing that groundedness, that rootedness that you begin to feel. There are boundaries sometimes that I have to set in kind of some different areas of my life at times that I can still feel quite uneasy in even just thinking about it, and certainly setting it and absolutely enforcing it. I think the difference is that instead of just automatically having the thought and then the fear coming up and telling me, no, you can't do that, and all the reasons why I can't do that, which would then keep me from doing it, instead of that being how it all plays out, I'm able to recognize that I want this boundary or that I need this boundary. I'm able to even feel like it's okay to set that boundary. I can notice the feelings that come up around it and think, okay, what am I afraid of? Is that really the likelihood of it happening, or the likelihood that that is going to be the case? And if it is, because sometimes it really might be, if that is the likelihood, the outcome, what does that mean? Does it mean that I'm wrong? Like if I try to set a boundary with somebody and they're unhappy about it and they get mad and yell at me and don't want to associate with me anymore, does that automatically mean that I'm wrong in setting that boundary? Absolutely not. In fact, if they respond that way, there's a good chance that boundary is really, really important. And the same is true for you. But when we recognize that that's what our fear is, or if we just imagine that playing out, it becomes so intense that we immediately want to take away any possibility of that happening. So now I'm able to kind of think realistically about it. And I would say certainly for the most part that the reality testing that I come to is, okay, even if they're not very happy about it, nothing bad ultimately is going to happen. And I do think that one of the really important things to consider when we're talking about setting boundaries with people in some aspect is if that person becomes really angry and doesn't understand it, doesn't like it, I'm honestly not able to come up with an actual example where this could be the case. Not saying that it doesn't exist, but I really can't come up with an example of where it would be the case. But generally speaking, if somebody is going to be angry about you setting that boundary, I think it would be important to evaluate the whole of your relationship and interaction with that person. Now, I guess one example that's just coming to mind is let's say you have committed to doing something. This person's asked you to do something, or you've had a conversation about doing something together, and you've committed to doing that. And then at the last minute, you decide, you know what, I just can't do this. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but for that other person, if they were planning it, counting on it, depending on it, or something like that, and you say, well, I just can't for, whatever the reason is, it's possible that that person could be angry, and maybe even rightfully so. Now, remember that anger is secondary to hurt or fear, but that person might actually feel angry. So in that circumstance, though, if you're canceling last minute, I think you do have some ownership in honoring yourself, maybe being more mindful of how you're going to honor yourself. Maybe give that person a little bit more notice, maybe not committing to it in the first place, if you know that that's not something you really want to do. Now, if there's an emergency or something like that and you can't help it, if that person gets angry, if you're grounded in knowing that what you're doing is not bad, does not make you a bad person, if that person gets angry, you'll be able to apologize, assuming that it is last minute and it creates some difficulty for this person. You can maybe apologize for it. You can maybe help that person understand that it's not personal, that it wasn't your intention or whatever. But if there's a pattern of that person becoming angry at you or not respecting the things that you want are important to you, that's something to kind of look at. Equally, if you tend to cancel things last minute, that's something for you to look at as well. Because again, it's probably important to not commit to something in the first place, or not put off canceling. And I know that that's a huge thing for a lot of people, and I used to be like that as well. We don't want to experience the outcome, and so we just avoid it, which is not a healthy thing to do. So coming back to the idea of fear, recognizing it, acknowledging it without judgment. And that's a really important part of this too, because a lot of times people will say, well, I'm afraid this person's going to walk out of my life. And then you think, but I know that that's probably not going to happen. And how stupid am I to think that or to be afraid of that? That's judgment. No judgment. So just being able to recognize, I really have this fear that this person is going to be mad at me and they're never going to want to talk to me again. No judgment about that. Just acknowledging that's what my fear is. And then you can think to yourself, okay, how likely is that to happen? Or if this person did get angry, that doesn't necessarily say anything about who I am. It doesn't really mean anything about me doing something that is wrong or bad, or certainly being a bad person. And if you are working with a therapist and boundaries is something that you're struggling with, spending some time talking about what those specific fears are really might be a very important part of your overall journey. Because while we're talking about it specifically as it relates to boundaries, those fears tend to come from beliefs that you hold about yourself anyway. And those fears likely come up in some other areas as well. So being able to recognize what those fears are can be a really important part of your overall journey. So if anything that I shared does feel difficult to wrap your head around, you're not quite understanding, definitely leave me a comment or ask for some clarification down below, because I know it really can be difficult when you haven't yet experienced something to understand not only what that can look like, but what it really actually means. So feel free to leave those questions in the comments below. And if there is a boundary that you are trying to set, or know that there are some boundaries that you need to create in your life, but you're just feeling overwhelmed at what that could mean, take it one little step at a time. And just being able to recognize the fears around them, and maybe just one fear, because often the fears are going to overlap into different types of boundaries or different people that you might set a boundary with. So just one step at a time, trying to recognize that. And if you are, again, working with somebody, you can really kind of work through some of that. You can begin to understand how you can do some realistic reality testing around that. Role playing sometimes can be helpful as well. I think it's more helpful for some people than it is for others. But if you're somebody that really feels kind of empowered by that, if it really helps you feel more confident in something, then absolutely do some role playing with that as well. You could even journal about it, like the potential outcomes, and journaling through that, like how you would get yourself through that, can be really helpful as well. So thank you for being here. If you'd like to share anything else, what came up for you as you listened, I'd love for you to share that below as well. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.